Alright, for my next story, I'll read The Medicine Woman. The tent maker explained to us how to reach the mountain village that we had pointed out to him on the map. One of the man's eyes was covered with a milky blue film, and his other brown eye peered at us with distrust, yet with a grudging interest. He made another remark, and our translator said, "The fellow says, why you go there? Tell him we want to find the woman who makes medicine from plants." After our translator conveyed my reply, the tent maker smiled, displaying his rotted, tobacco-stained teeth. Then he made some remark. I glanced at the translator. He says, "You gringos always want to visit the witch." I glanced at the other two members of our intrepid expedition. First I looked at Vince, his face covered with grime and a sheen of sweat, his dark hair combed back from his brow, held in check with pomade. Then I looked at Willie, his balding buzz cut, the sharp contour of his thin man's face. They both wore these expressions of uneasy chagrin at the news that we were not the first to have made this pilgrimage. We soon set off, our gear and supplies carried on the backs of a pair of llamas. After a half hour, the narrow road had narrowed even further to a footpath. On either side of us, the jungle loomed, a steamy, fetid tangle of trees and vegetation. The trail gradually grew steeper and steeper. "I don't know about anyone else, but I need a fucking break," said Willie, leaning down with his hands pressed above his knees. "Okay, we're due for a rest," I said. "We'll stay here for 10 minutes and then push on." Willie stood back up and took a pack of cigarettes from the pocket of his sweat-soaked shirt and lit one. Vince said, "You ought to give those up. Someday you'll wish you didn't have to breathe from a tank of oxygen." I was never good at planning ahead. As my two partners began to trade insults, I studied the map in light of what the tent maker had told us. The road had been washed out in several places after a recent prolonged downpour, so we would have to guide the animals up around these places where the road had caved down the mountainside. These detours would prove difficult, physically challenging. We were forced to back out of a steep trail with our machetes. We were forced to hack out a steep trail with our machetes, and the sure-footed llamas, with patience and apparent indifference, followed. Toward nightfall, we plodded wearily into the village. Naked children and small dogs chased around us. The adults stood near the doorways to their huts and eyed us with suspicion. Presently, a man wearing only a loincloth walked up to us and began speaking in his Indian dialect. The translator from another nearby tribe did his best to serve as intermediary. When the tribesman spoke, he did not look at the translator. His eyes fell on mine, a gaze from a man of stern authority whom I immediately took to be the head of the village, the leader of this particular clan. His voice was deep and penetrating. His tone was hardly welcoming. As he spoke, I flicked a glance at Vince and Willie just to catch the look on their faces. They both seemed a bit dazed, as if they had not expected an Indian to be so fluent in his own native tongue, and they both seemed to be thinking, "Now here is a hombre you don't want to fuck with, especially not this deep in his own territory, practically on his own doorstep." I glanced back at my foreign counterpart and studied his face as our translator told us what he just said. "Twice before a small group of white people have come here. At least you have enough sense not to bring along any woman. Now, tell me why you have come here." I too ignored the translator and gazed intently at my adversary. We have come here to speak to the woman who makes medicine from plants and insects and snakes and other creatures. Of course you have, as did the others. We wish to learn from you, I said. When you leave, you must vow to tell your people not to return here. We do not wish to be changed by the white man. I will pass your words along to others like me who live in cities and teach others about people like you from the deep forest, but I cannot promise that others will not come after me. I understand little of your white man ways, but I see the clothes you wear, the things you carry in addition to your guns. You people are much like us. You will take from another tribe if they allow it. That is true, I agree. But how can the world belong to us? We belong to the world. Then he stepped aside, as did the others behind him, and we pressed on, this time scrutinized very closely by the villagers who wore various expressions of anxiety, curiosity, puzzlement, amusement, and contempt. They were all very quiet as we passed this shoulder-to-shoulder assemblage of people, but once a few yards beyond them, we could hear them erupt into a babble of passionate discussion over who we were and what we were doing there. Willie was the first to voice his opinion over what we had all just experienced. At least none of those fuckers decided we'd all make nice targets for their blow darts. There are a lot of them out there we never came close to seeing. Vince glanced at me for a moment and continued to interrogate me with his gaze after he said, "Willie the wanker's right about that, boss. We don't want to give those people any reason to get angry at us, because if that happens, we're all dead." "You pair of deadbeats need to look sharp," I shot back, "and stop lambasting each other, one mockery more dreary than the next. None of us are going to do anything stupid. Just remember, the more plant samples we manage to bring back, samples of different plants, mind you, the more money we make. If we fail to make friends with them, I don't know what we'll do. Use trickery, I suppose." The footpath grew steeper, but the pack animals didn't seem to mind at all. For them, it was a stroll around the park. For us, it was hard work merely to place one foot in front of the other. And for Willie, in particular, the upward hike was kicking his ass hard. His face was scarlet and dripping wet. I went on a few steps further, then turned around to look at them. "I never expected we'd have to climb a trail this steep," I called back to them, my lungs still heaving for air. "Gregorio and I will keep going. If we're gone for more than 12 hours, leave immediately. Make sure you bypass the village. Even if women happen to be there, don't make the fatal mistake of believing them harmless." Vince looked at me. "Are you sure you want to do this? We can all go back now, call the whole thing off, explain to the chief back there that we made a horrible mistake coming here and fucking up their day. Man, and we promised to spread the word that you people belong to the world. We're not going anywhere. We get that, and we also know that you people are just as smart as we are. You'll be one of their better spokesmen. But once the chemists, once those lab coat boys manage to identify and then synthesize every single constituent of any given plant, many of which probably work all together and all at once in a particular way on the human body, but that's none of my concern. My concern, and yours, don't forget, is to obtain as many samples of as wide an assortment of plants as possible. So I'll find this mythical medicine woman, and maybe I can win her affections. Who knows?" So now only two of us forged ahead, me and my indispensable translator, Gregorio, who spoke fluent English is Ecuadorian Spanish, and 3 Indian dialects, including this one. After Vince and Willie and I got to the last town of any size on an overloaded bus out of Quito, we went to the first cantina we could find for some well-earned leisure, followed by further recreational pleasures later on that night. While my 2 compatriots had their customary fun, I would be looking for any person healthy enough to hike 10 miles in one day and educated enough to speak English, and who just happened to know the Chicha dialect spoken by their neighboring tribe, mention of whom brought a cascade of soured looks. But at that point I still didn't know that we weren't the first white people these folks had seen. Even the fellow I found later, Gregorio, never bothered to tell us. Of course, he knew about both previous parties since he'd worked for both of them as translator as well. I have a unique talent in my home village, he told me. Not only do I earn my living by writing letters for other people and offering a little advice now and again about immigration matters and other legal issues, but every so often some people from the United States show up. But why you come here is none of my business. Unlike most people in this town, I had the balls to take off to Quito when I finished high school. I learned how to make money in various ways, and then I enrolled at the university. I would have phoned my parents to give them this good news, my reason for going to Quito in the first place, but no one has a cell phone in my village. I found out a great deal about Gregorio, though sometimes I reserve judgment on the, shall we say, facticity of some of the fellow's stories. In fact, Vince and Willie found our enterprising translator quite entertaining, while all of us happened to be gazing into our evening campfire. Now he and I would try to find this fabled woman, gain her good graces with all of Gregorio's charms, hopefully, and then ask her to tell us about her art of medicine. Gregorio hiked ahead of me, leading one of the llamas while I led the other. The llamas were ordinarily docile creatures, but some Peruvian Ecuadorian sheep herders contracted to work on ranches in Idaho and Montana and elsewhere introduced the llama into North American sheep ranching. They would charge at a wolf far more convincingly than a dog, and could use their forelegs with whiplash skill. But here in the mountainous Ecuadorian jungle, the llama had their own predator to worry about, large cats, panthers, and jaguars. The steep pitch of the trail began to recede. We were coming to a plateau, perhaps some sylvan meadow where this woman lived. I wondered how old she was, why the rumors about her had always been tantalizingly vague. In a few more minutes we came to a clearing, at the far end of which was a hut, its roof covered with palm leaves. Like all the other village huts we'd seen, only this structure was at least twice the size of the others. Wood smoke issued upward from the center of the cone-shaped roof. When we were within 10 yards from the hut, a woman stepped out from the darkened opening and looked at us. Gregorio greeted her, and at first she said nothing. She stood in front of her home. She wore a soiled yellow sarong. Her feet were bare and looked as though earlier she'd walked through mud. She had to be at least in her mid-40s. Seeing her teeth would give me a better indication of her age. Her shining black hair was pulled back from her brow, wound into a bun, which in turn was held in check with a pair of needles made of what looked like carved bone. Her dark brown eyes were deep set, her cheeks lined with thin wrinkles. Her eyes widened some, her expression of grave ferocity gave way to a more inquisitive look. Then she spoke and her hands rose in the air in accordance with her thoughts. As she spoke, her gaze shifted from Gregorio to me. Gregorio looked at me and said, "She's not happy that I brought another white man to see her. She wants to know what you will give her in trade for her knowledge. Tell her that we have brought bolts of cloth, a walk, whiskey, sandals, nuts, and dried fruit, dried meat, knives, scissors. Give her the whole rundown, just like we talked about. Don't leave anything out. Gregorio passed all this information along. She thought about this for a moment and spat off to the side, then continued to stare at me. In another moment she began to speak, and while continuing to speak, she began to walk toward me. After we stood face to face, she dropped into silence. Gregorio said, "She says any villager is welcome here, but not strangers from places far away unless they bring gifts. And you have brought gifts, so you are also welcome." Then she said, "Unload the animals and let them rest. After that, come inside and drink some tea." I could feel a hint of a smile creep across my face, but she was having none of it and turned away and returned inside. Gregorio and I got busy, unloaded the llamas, and carried our bartering goods into the hut. As soon as I entered, I was assailed by the distinct scent of damp earth, as if I had entered a cave. Along the curving walls were bamboo shelves, all of them filled with clay jars. She squatted next to the fire in the middle of the hut and reached for a steaming, short-spouted pot with an iron bar and lifted it by its smoke-blackened handle, lifted it away from the fire and set the pot on a flat stone where she'd already placed 3 clay cups. Around this large flat stone we sat on the floor and drank tea. She never smiled, so I never got a good look at her teeth. She said she would take us into the forest to pick the plants she uses for medicines. I asked her how she had gained this knowledge, and Gregorio translated that she'd learned from the woman who raised her after both her parents died from sickness. Since she was now apparently satisfied with the itemized list of goods Gregorio had specified, we indeed brought with us, and had consented to take us with her the following day when she went to collect plants for her medicines, and had promised to explain what sickness each plant was used to treat, which in turn would give the boys in the pharmacology lab more to go on. I later slipped away after Gregorio had pitched camp for the night. I returned along the trail we'd marked for ourselves earlier, waving about a 6-volt flashlight which illuminated the trail in front of me. In just under an hour I came up to our campfire. The 2 of them were both sitting on the ground, cross-legged, each with a bored gaze peering into the fire. Willie happened to see me first. "Well, did you find her?" "She has a large hut about an hour's hike from here. But listen up. She's not stupid, and she's going to play ball thanks to all that shit we brought along. But why rock the boat? You guys stay here. Gregorio and I will keep it simple. She might feel differently if she sees 3 white men show up again instead of only 1. "The split's still the same?" asked Vince skeptically. "What we agreed on from the beginning. After all, you 2 guys helped me get here." "All right, fuck, I don't care. If you don't want us to help you pick weeds, Willie and I will just sit here and scratch our butts for how long this time?" "I'll give it another 12 hours. If she doesn't give us any trouble, we should be back by then. If we don't show by then, get the fuck out of here." "Okay, buddy, it's your call. I just don't want to spook her." Got it. I went back along the trail once more, immersed in the shrill churning of the jungle, the thousands upon thousands of insects stirring nearby. As the beam from the flashlight danced in front of me, I felt an uprush of pleasure at the thought that our venture would be successful, and our profit well worth the risk we'd taken. When I returned to our campsite, Gregorio was seated by the fire with a small book in his hand, which he closed and set in his lap as I approached. "Did you find your friends still there?" he asked. "Well, they looked rather bored," I said, "and they weren't terribly aggrieved when I told them I wanted them to stay where they were." "Why do you not want them here?" The lady might not care for the extra visitors. I don't want to make her uncomfortable. Besides, she agreed to help me. The other 2 don't need to be here." Early the next morning, she walked up to our campsite where we were drinking coffee and eating tortillas for breakfast. I told Gregorio to ask her if she'd like some coffee, and something to eat. I listened to her as she spoke to Gregorio, and he soon said, "She will have some coffee." I poured a cup for her and handed it to her. She looked into my eyes as she took the cup from my hands, her fingers touching my hand for a moment. Her gaze was steady, though not unfriendly. She said something to me and Gregorio translated. She says, "The sun has burned your white face, and she will give you some salve before we leave." "You're very kind," I said to her. Strapped to her back was a straw basket. She drank some more coffee, handed the cup back to me, and started to walk into the jungle. Gregorio and I scrambled to grab our machetes and empty backpacks and followed. We worked through most of the morning. She would extract a plant from the ground or merely sever its stem. We did the same. With each new plant, she would explain what it was used for. As Gregorio translated, I took furious notes and clipped these to the respective samples, which were layered and separated by cheesecloth within our backpacks. Once again in front of her hut, Gregorio and I loaded the llamas with the far lighter return load. The woman came out of her hut, and in her hand she carried a small clay pot and walked up to me. She spoke something to me. Gregorio translated, "She wants to spread the salve on your face." I looked into her eyes and simply nodded. She dipped her fingers of one hand into the pot and carefully spread a greasy substance with a horrific smell across my cheeks and forehead, my nose and chin. Her manner was very contained, businesslike. In a few moments she was done. Just before we left, we waved goodbye to her. In return, she lifted her chin, her hands at her sides. When Gregorio and I reached the other camp, dusk had set in. We had no need to hike back to the last village at night, each of us with a flashlight in hand, so I said that we'd start out in the morning, and of course that was fine with them. Unless we were being chased by a pack of machete-wielding natives, foot travel at night was pointless at best. I then went to a small stream we'd crossed just before we split into two groups. I knelt down on the sodden floor of the jungle next to the rivulet, cupped my hands into the flowing water, sinking my hands up to my wrists. I splashed water over my face greedily, handful after handful, as though I were performing some religious rite of cleansing and purification. Vince was getting a fire started so we could all get some hot food into our bellies. I had my mind on a whole can of chili for the last few hours, and I was damn hungry. He was squatting next to the fire, adding whatever he thought might burn in a place where rainfall is a daily event, at least for a few minutes. He glanced at me, and then his expression took on that of stark surprise. He stood up now with a look of profound uncertainty and said, "What the hell happened to your face, boss?" "What are you talking about?" "Well, you look different," he said, almost as though he were offended. "What the hell do you mean I look different?" With some difficulty he said, "You look like some other guy." "Who? How the fuck should I know?" Following this, Vince and Willie avoided me as much as possible. Whenever we happened to need to exchange a few remarks, they kept their glances at me to a minimum. Gregorio behaved as though nothing had happened. The following morning we set out on the return journey to the village where Gregorio lived and from which we would take the bus back to Quito and catch a flight back to the States. Near mid-afternoon we got to the village. I paid Gregorio for his services and gave the bonus I had mentioned if our expedition turned out to be a productive one, which it had. He hurried off, and that was the last we saw of him. The three of us went into a cantina and we ordered a round of beers. Then I got up from the table and went to the restroom to see what the hell Vince was talking about. Staring back at me from the mirror was a dour, apprehensive man stricken by disbelief.